10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Game over.
Welcome to Game Over Montreal in what started out like a pretty ugly game overall for the Montreal Canadiens. They stuck with it and delivered a pretty decent performance. And hey, putting up a good fight and losing is pretty much exactly what you want from this team right now anyway, as they continue their trek towards first overall in the draft in Montreal. But let's chat about this game. I'm going to bring in Paul Campbell. How's it going, Paul?
Hey, Andrew, it's going really well, actually. It was a surprisingly entertaining game.
Yeah, and we should say Paul is a goalie guy. He works for InGoal Magazine. He signed up to this game expecting to talk about Carey Price and John Gibson, and instead he got Alex Stolarz, Kaden Primeau, and then bonus Sam Montembeault.
You had to check the program, right, to see who the goalies actually were. You're like, who are these guys? But at least I got to see three. So I mean that's a bonus, right? It's not John Gibson, Carey Price, but it's three instead of two. That's not bad.
Yeah, it's a decent deal. You got three for the price of two,
and lots of goals. Not what I expected when I signed up, but entertaining nonetheless.
Yeah, it was a decent game. I think that it's an interesting game based on the conversations that are happening in Montreal right now, and I think people are looking for things to talk about, especially in media, right? Because there's only so much you can say about a team that's been this bad for this long and still get people to tune into what you're talking about, right? And Unfortunately, it seems like what's been keyed in on a little bit is the idea of a goaltender controversy for the Canadiens' third string position. And this game isn't going to help the way that people are viewing Kaden Primeau right now. And I want to get your opinion on this because I think watching Kaden Primeau in this season, all people really want to see from him is like some level of consistency and to be okay. Like just don't lose games. And I don't know if I like really put this one on him, but at the same time, I don't not put on him, you know what I mean? Like he wasn't great. I thought his last game was significantly worse than this one. But overall, is he as bad as the numbers say? I don't think that he is. I think he's in a crap situation, and also this is his 7th game.
Yeah, and it's easy to forget that, right? I mean, and we talked about this before. His first game up, his first few games in the NHL, he looked like he was scared to death. Now he doesn't, but he occasionally plays like he's scared to death, and that's the troubling part. So clearly, he's cleared most of that away. He's got away from those early jitters. But now there are problems in his game, not just his mental game, but his actual technique that are starting to get exposed. The more games he sees behind a poor team, the more these problems are going to rear their ugly heads, and that's what's happening to him lately. That there's another issue that's plaguing him, and this will work into the mental eventually, and that's they're protecting him, right? Obviously, he lets in a few goals. They're like, that they were tonight and they have before. Lets in a couple goals. We don't want to make him. We don't want to ruin his confidence, right? Well, honestly, at this point, it doesn't matter if he's in for 5, if he's in for 3 in a period. It doesn't matter. At some point, I mean, they're trying to go for the win still, right? I guess so. That's sort of the idea. Like, oh well, we still have a chance to win. We'll maybe save his ego and we'll to change goalies and see what we can do. But at some point you leave him in there and you let him battle it out, and you let him die if he dies. And I think that's an underrated aspect of goaltender development. Sometimes you just have to put a guy out there, let him face the whole thing, let him know that no matter what happens tonight, it's you. So if you let in a bad goal, you got to recover. And if you're having a bad period, you got to recover. And that's something I think that they're not doing, and they're protecting him in a way, but also they're not giving him the kind of exposure that a team like this could give him, which is stay in there and battle like the team did. The team stayed and they hung around, they battled, and they almost eked it out. Weidman made this a beautiful defensive play at the very end, right? Like, where did that come from? Well, he's gutting it out, right? He's doing his best. And sometimes I think you got to let the young goalie do the same thing. And I hope they will do that going forward if he gets a chance to play much more, because they seem to be more comfortable with Montembeault at this point when he's healthy.
Yeah, and I've seen a lot of talk about Montembeault being maybe the goaltender of the future instead of Primeau. I think we really need to take age into account with that, because the difference between a 22-year-old goaltender and a 25-year-old goaltender to me is like very large. Like it's only 3 years, but those are 3 very big years in terms of development. And Montembeault's on a bit of a heater right now. I think that his last stretch of like 4 starts or 5 starts has actually been really good.
Mm-hmm.
But if we look back to like 7 starts into the season, I don't think his numbers were better than Primeau's are right now. So I think that Montembeault has benefited a little bit from being able to dig himself out of situations and having to sit there and be the guy, well, like Jake Allen's been hurt or Jake Allen's been not available because he's been overplayed. And what you're talking about with Primeau, like they do need to let him sink or swim a little bit. They're maybe trying to protect his head a little bit, but at the same time, it has to be difficult for a goaltender to think like, if I have a bad first period, I'm getting yanked no matter what. Like I have no opportunity to get myself back into it. And I'm not as fast to throw in the towel on Primeau, but I'm also not of the opinion that he's like a super high-end prospect either.
No, and when people talk about the goaltender of the future of Montreal, I don't believe we know who that is, right? Goaltenders keep going through Montreal basically under the shadow of Carey Price. So either goalies come in as prospects who we seldom see, they come in as backups who we see more often than we'd like because Carey Price keeps getting injured, or we see Carey Price. So we have this whole circulation of goaltenders going on in the background. All these goalies who, people want to hype up, like, oh, maybe he's the guy of the future. Maybe, as soon as a goalie comes along who's the right age to take over for Price, when Price eventually calls it quits, they keep calling him that goalie. Well, we haven't seen that, right? There's nothing, any goaltender who makes it to this level, if they do everything right, if their developmental trajectory is good, if they have the right mental game, if they get the right help with their technique, they can be a good goaltender in the NHL, right? The difference between goalies at this level isn't that great. There's some exceptions on either end. Primeau could be a good goaltender. He could be a good backup. Maybe he could be a starter. But what he's shown us so far does not indicate any of that to me. And what I've seen from him so far this season is unimpressive. So compounding that is the fact that he is being saved, right, by the coach. He is being protected, and so he's not having a chance to show more, right? It's like your kid. If every time your kid struggles with something, you take it away from them and do it, you've just stolen their chance to learn that thing, right? If every time your kid is having a hard time, you pick them up and whisk them away and save them, they're never going to learn how to deal with that situation, and they're going to lose their confidence. They'll be like, well, I can't do it anyway. Dad's going to do it for me. We need not to do that, right? This is a year where you can throw a guy to the wolves now and then, and I think that needs to happen for the sake of his development. There are elements of his game tonight. I was watching it. I'm like, this doesn't belong at this level, right? Like, and he can be better than that. He just hasn't been, and until he shows that he can be, the faith that the fan base is putting in him is just misplaced.
Yeah, 100%. A comment here from Dixon Automotive Group says, please move on from Primeau, and can we just trade the players we don't want for Zegras? Listen, we all wish. We all wish, don't we? It'd be a great world if we could do that. And it was like in like EA Sports, where you could like compound up the value as it builds up. You just add players you don't care about.
Just
trade them for Trevor Zegras.
How many backup goalies can we put in this trade and not have the machine break?
Seriously.
That's the question.
Unfortunately, the Anaheim Ducks are also managed by a human being, and they would not give up Trevor Zegras, I don't think, for any player on the Montreal Canadiens. That goal that he scored, like, come on.
So good.
There's
good too.
There's the Michigan, and there's doing it at full speed on a wraparound. Like,
what I
that's
really
not
loved
fair.
what I really loved about that goal, first of all, it was the most casual Michigan lacrosse goal I've ever seen.
Yep.
I didn't realize that it happened until it was happening. Like the goal had gone in. I was like, that just happened, because there was no setup, there was no lingering behind the net, right? It's not like he tried it or faked it. What I loved about this is the deception. So he faked the shot, right? So the goaltender has to be honest, right? Has to stay on that. He leans in like he's going to shoot, then he carries around, leans his shoulder. As soon as he starts to carry, Montembeault, not Montembeault, Primeau has
No,
to
it was
move.
Montembeault, I think. Wasn't it like
Oh, was it? Okay.
it was the first shot he faced, which is
That's right.
like totally
Welcome to the game.
unfair.
Welcome to the game. And so he has to respect that. As soon as Zegras is moving with speed behind the net, he just has to switch posts. The goaltender just doesn't have time to look. And the defender, I think it was Savard, was sort of halfway, and he could have maybe cut him down if he'd noticed, but it was so fast and so casual that he didn't. And
Yeah.
it was almost unopposed, that goal. I mean, it was just brilliant, from the deception to the speed to the casualness. It was one of the nicest versions of that I've ever seen.
Yeah, and I think there's a temptation, especially because it's David Savard, and it seems like every goal that goes in, David Savard is on the ice all season. There's definitely a temptation to put blame on guys, and like we have Leon, I don't know how you'd rather be pronounced in the chat, saying Monty didn't have a chance. I kind of agree. I think the way Paul laid it out there, he probably didn't have a chance. Maybe get lucky and make that save, but that would be luck, right? And with Savard, he kind of has to respect the idea that Zegras can cut out front and make a pass, right? So he has to cut off the middle. Yeah. And there was actually somebody on the other side of the net. So like, it would be satisfying to watch Savard kind of come around and maybe like level a guy trying to go around the net like that. But it's just not a play that a smart defenseman can make. So it's like, what a beautiful, beautiful set of plays by Zegras to create that situation. And the finish, my God.
Yeah, it was perfect. Was it a power play?
I don't think so.
No, okay. It seemed like it. Basically, the way he exposed Savard on the play, Savard was stuck halfway. He was covering a man in front. He saw Zegras go to the far side. He moved toward him, but he couldn't move as quickly as he'd like, because he couldn't abandon the play, and he had to respect that if Zegras came and made that pass, he was going to get beat that way. So he was stuck between a rock and a hard place. I just think on that goal, you tip your hat. Like, he did it. Yeah. He did it as well as I've ever seen. So I mean, yeah, you want to stop him, but you can't strategize. Everything's a trade-off, right? And you're going to give up more than you're going to get by trying to defend against that specific goal too often, or making that move to attack that guy too quickly, when really it's still a low percentage play, and it's even a low percentage to try play. So you got to try to defend against it when it happens, but you can't put all your defensive eggs in that basket.
Yeah, I'm totally with you. The guys that excelled in this game for Montreal, because I think we kind of mentioned that they did put up a good fight, and I think it's important to focus on that a little bit, because in a season like this, we've got to hold on with both hands to every positive. For all the fans out there who are still watching these games, you need something to talk about the next morning. And obviously, Jake Evans had a great night tonight, him and Rem Pitlick, but the guy who consistently stood out to me more than anyone else on the ice was Arturi Lehkonen. And I've been very on the out there saying I think the Canadiens need to hang on to Arturi Lehkonen through this rebuild, because he's the kind of guy that shows the next generation essentially how it's done. He clearly wants to wear the jersey. He's, I would argue, the only guy on the roster who has given 100% effort every game he's played this season. Having a great season amid a terrible season for almost everybody. Even offensively, based on his previous years, Lehkonen's doing all right. Scored his first power play goal since 2018 today. Not that he's had a lot of power play time,
of course,
but I see more and more trust being given to this player, and I'm just running out of scenarios where it makes sense to trade him, because to me, I don't think that they're going to get a first round pick for him, because his reputation around the league is just not high enough. And I don't see a scenario where they get good enough value to trade Lehkonen and not get a first round pick.
Teams trade for, I mean, they trade their first rounders. They trade real assets for goals. Lehkonen doesn't have them. I mean, he can score, right? He showed he's physically capable of doing it, but his finish is the weakest part of his game, and that's the part that teams are going to really value. Now, a smart team would give something up for him because he could be an excellent piece in a lot of. He's one of the few players on the Canadiens I can see going to a contender tomorrow and just seamlessly fitting into a role on their team because he can play that role so well. He has such great defensive instincts. He's so hard on the puck. He's good on the forecheck and back check. His positioning is immaculate. So, I mean, teams love that stuff. If the guy could figure out how to, could figure out how to score, could figure out how to finish, he'd be a 50-goal scorer. However, even as he is, I think that he's going to be worth more to keep than he is to trade. So, and how old is he? He is not. He's not one of the graybeards. He's in his late 20s. He's
26.
Okay. So he's a bit younger than I thought. He's just mature, which is why I thought that. Yeah. So I mean, keep him around. I 100% agree with that. Remember the Habs got rid of Eller?
Yes,
it's not the same.
I remember being very angry because when they first traded Eller, I was annoyed because I was a big fan of Lars Eller. But the return that they got of 2 second-round picks in that draft, I was like, you know what? That's decent. Then they turned around and traded those 2 second-round picks for Andrew Shaw, who in my estimation was a less impactful player than Lars Eller. Now, my opinion was changed about Andrew Shaw as a player in Montreal. I think his time in Montreal, he was a better player than he was in Chicago. I still don't think he was as important of a player as Lars Eller was because of the position. Like, they needed Eller down the middle, right? And the insulation that he gave to the youngsters like Galchenyuk was felt when he was lost. So, bad trade, but yes, I do remember that.
Well, and people know what they've lost once they've lost, and sometimes not till then, right? So, people in Pittsburgh keep talking about trade Malkin. Everyone knows as soon as he leaves, you've lost Evgeny Malkin, right? You're going to notice that right away. You can anticipate losing that. You lose a guy like Eller, you lose a guy like Lehkonen, you think, okay, well, he didn't bring many goals. We're going to get something back. But then you see the trickle-down effect, right? Or the knock-on effects of not having that solid, stable consistency in the middle of your lineup. And it's hard to replace. And then all the pieces start moving around and you lose, and the whole team, right, loses some stability or consistency. It's almost like removing a keystone, the structure collapses. This one guy didn't seem to be doing that much, right? He wasn't contributing that much, but then you realize, looking back to a guy like Plekanec, right? He was a phenomenal force on that team. He wasn't a highlight reel scorer, right? He wasn't an offensive dynamo, even though he carried his weight. But he just did everything that you asked him to do. He did it really well. He was really responsible, stable. You could bank on this guy, right? And I'm not putting Lehkonen as highly up as that, but he's that same kind of stable force.
Yeah, and you can see that same scenario playing out with losing Phil Deneau in the offseason, right?
100%.
Just look at the trickle-down effect of that. And, we've talked before on the show about, Nick Suzuki is having a disappointing offensive season. And, his underlying numbers also are not fantastic. But how many players are there across the NHL who are the coach's first choice at even strength? They're the first choice in the power play. They're the first choice on the penalty kill. And they're the first choice on 3-on-3. There are no breaks for Nick Suzuki where he is not 100% counted upon. There are very few players like that, and I think there's probably a very tiny handful of 22-year-olds who are relied on like that. Even guys like Connor McDavid is not going out there on the first wave of the penalty kill. He plays a ton of minutes at even strength in the power play because that's what they're trying to flex him for, but Suzuki is asked to do everything. And that's all partially due to the loss of Phil Deneau, who was a huge insulator for him and allowed him to have a lot of that success the first 2 years of his career. So you see that, and you can point to many examples of it. And Lehkonen is just such a guy that I think instills the work ethic that you want among your skill players as well. And I looked just quickly at like different teams that, like, let's say, even if you only value Lehkonen as a penalty killer, which he is fantastic at, but he is also a phenomenal even strength player. In fact, has one of the best grouping of underlying numbers at even strength in the entire league this season. A team that is, without a doubt, an absolute cup contender that has a terrible penalty kill that could probably really use a guy like Arturi Lehkonen, the Colorado Avalanche. How well would he fit on the Colorado Avalanche? Like, if I was Joe Sakic, I'd be banging down the door. And like, how much value does their first round pick have this year?
I mean, it's gonna be so late. It's essentially, it's functionally a second, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We'd assume. Yeah.
So like, that's the kind of scenario where I could see the Canadiens being tempted. I'm just not sold on it being 100% worth it. It's like him and Toffoli are the two guys that I think you want to keep to carry through to when you're out of this rebuild. Now, is this rebuild going to be quick enough that they're going to be useful pieces on the other side of it? I'm not convinced of that, but I think every time you see a team try to rebuild and they trade like every usable asset, it takes a long time to build up out of it. You have to have somebody who can be there as a leader. And, you know, if Carey Price is not going to be around because like the mystery around what's going on with him and the lack of transparency, we don't know what's going to happen there. You need somebody in the lineup, and obviously Shea Weber also not coming back.
Okay.
So hopefully we have some updates on Price coming soon, but they need somebody to stay.
I mean, people keep forgetting this. I don't know if managers do, but fans certainly do. You can't build something from nothing unless you're an expansion. Like, unless you want to be an expansion team suddenly, right? You're not, and even then, you're not building from nothing, right? Your team needs an identity. It needs something to build around. It needs a model to build through. And if you're basically, the draft is you're collecting pieces, right? You're going to somehow put these pieces together. What are you attaching them to, right? You don't know who you're going to get the year after, right? You don't know what these draft picks are going to look like in 3 years. You can't have a rudderless ship just sort of ramming through, the draft waters, just picking up treasure, right? It's not going to work. I mean, Buffalo was maybe the best example in recent years of a team who tanked as desperately as possible. They sold away everything. They had two well-performing goalies, really overperforming goalies. They traded both of them, right? Well, you exit the rebuild, or maybe you don't, but you try to exit the rebuild. Oh, look at that. We have no talent. How did that happen? We traded it all away, right? You can't just squander the present for the future willy-nilly, because people in your organization currently, for the most part, are established NHL players. What percentage of second rounders become established NHL players, right?
I think it's like less than 30%, or like just at 30%.
So keep moving down the rounds, it keeps diminishing. So if you're trading a pretty good player, say a third liner, right, for a second rounder, or even a couple of second rounders, your odds of hitting, and what are you going to get, right? You have no guarantee that talent out is going to equal talent coming in. In fact, often it ends up being not the case. And so then you're left with some new guys who are really good, and your old guys all get traded away. So you have like the third tier of those guys. It just doesn't work. You need people to carry through.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that this management group is going to be very cognizant of that. It seems like Kent Hughes, from what I've heard, Kent Hughes values Arturi Lehkonen. Now, that could mean that he's just not going to trade him for nothing, right? That he wants to get a good return for him because he is on an expiring contract. And I do think, like, if Lehkonen is properly valued, he has phenomenal trade value, right? If teams are smart enough to know how good he is and how impactful he is. But that's a big if in the NHL. So who knows? I do want to get your opinion of Sam Montembeault in this game, because obviously he didn't face a lot of shots. First shot he faces is that Zegras goal, but kind of like battled through it and gave the Canadiens a chance to win this game. And obviously has been very good the last few starts. Are you seeing things round out to form for him, or is it just a matter of like eventually he was going to get hot a little?
broken clocks or something like that.
Yeah.
You know what? I'm not a huge fan of Montembeault, although I was on a different it won't be a podcast, something. I was talking to someone earlier today, and I had some clear set analytics data, and I had sort of top 20 lists for their version of goals saved above average, and what's the other one? Save percentage differential. So like his expected save percentage, for based on the defensive environment is X, but he's overperforming that. So he's and Montembeault made the list. I was shocked. And he wasn't part of the conversation. It was sort of a Vezina related conversation, but I saw his name and I was like, this is absolutely staggering. That because sample size doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how many games you've played. As long as your save percentage is higher than what would have been expected given this defensive environment, then you're going to do okay. And that's the list he made. I thought, okay, there's something here. You don't make this list unless you're performing really well in the games that you did play. So statistically, it's one of the very few positives that I've seen in the sort of Canadiens goaltending arsenal since Allen went down.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because I think there was a lot to point to early in the season where he wasn't awful, but he wasn't amazing, and the Canadiens in front of him had I don't know if the Canadiens have given a worse ride to any goaltender in recent memory. Like he's just not had an opportunity to shine, and I'm happy for him because it just looked like earlier in the season when he would let in a couple of goals and he'd take his mask off and take a sip of his water. It just seemed like he was like looking at the ghosts of his past, like that gif of the dog that's like got like the PTSD that goes around and like flashes back to the war. That's how Sam Montembeault looked to me. So the fact that he's getting some good things happening for him now, I'm very happy for him. He seems like a nice kid. And I'm kind of with you that like at 25 years old, you kind of want like that's who you are, right? For the most part. So if you want to be like a goalie of the future, and I'm not saying this is what Sam Montembeault is expected to be, you want him to be a little bit better than he is, but it's encouraging to see that he's actually performing above expectations because, I mean, the numbers aren't great, but that's just raw numbers, right? So if analytics are saying that he's actually been decent, that's a nice little story for the Montreal Canadiens.
I mean, like you said, grab the positives with both hands and hold on to them. Let him have his run, right? Like, tandem him, get Primeau in and, move him back and forth. I don't know what Allen's status is right now and when he's expected to return. But I mean, as of this point, is Montembeault gonna benefit more from sort of keeping this run, this kind of run he's having going? And is Primeau going to benefit from, getting some more seasoning, in the A? Maybe that's where this can go, for some of the rest of the season. I mean, if you're going to shelter Primeau anyway, to the extent that they have, and end up putting Montembeault or McNiven or Allen when he comes back in as soon as he falters, put him in a place where he's going to falter less frequently, where he has to just gut it out, and where he's been performing well, and then bring him up occasionally, for spot duty or for the odd start, and let Montembeault run for a while. I mean, tonight he didn't have much to do, but he looked solid, right? He gave them a chance. He didn't give up. He kept battling. I mean, what more can you ask?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, what's the harm at this point in the season, right? Like, what are you going to lose? And that's kind of like my frustration with a lot of the decisions that this coaching staff has made, is there doesn't seem to be many things that are put together looking towards the future. It still seems like we're trying to like balance lines, and it's like I don't understand the point of that. Put together the guys you think are going to stay here and let them figure it out. Obviously, when Caulfield is back, that means you stick him with somebody who can make some plays for him and that he can skate with and not bounce him around on the fourth line, or you send him down to the American Hockey League and let him enjoy playing hockey for a little bit, because I don't think he's had an enjoyable year in Montreal. And at this point, I know that his agent probably won't be happy if he gets sent down, and he probably won't be happy because he loses a lot of money on that entry-level deal. But at the same time, it must be a little bit easier to breathe in Laval than it is in Montreal right now, because
Well, also like this is an old thing that a lot of analytics people have identified for a long time. But playing playing a scorer, like a perennial like career scorer, just slick mitts on the fourth line to like help him learn the game. You're playing a different game on the fourth line than you are on the first line. So while your minutes are sheltered, and hopefully you're getting like okay matchups, the quality of teammate matters a lot more than the quality of competition for a scorer. So you're on your fourth line, you're surrounded by guys who aren't going to set you up the same way at all. The game moves differently when you're on the fourth line, right? Your opportunities are different. You're not going to get back out to the next shift. The flow is different. You get into the game differently. Also, when you are expected to, sometimes in the fourth line, you get overmatched, right? Like they end up getting their first line out. And then you're a tiny man who's expected to like, shut down. It's absurd, right? It's not helping. It's not helping anyone. It's neither helping the team nor him personally. So I'm with you. Move him up, put him with someone, or put him back in the A where he can, when he can dominate on a top line.
Yeah, and speaking of not dominating, I don't want to like rag on him too much. And I was told by Julian McKenzie, because I was kind of chatting with him during the game, that he was part of the first Evans goal. He like kind of moved the puck up the ice that created the play. But until the broadcast mentioned him late in the third period, I don't think I realized that Josh Anderson was playing tonight. Like, he kind of does this thing where like he'll be in games where he is the most noticeable guy on the ice, and he's just like physically dominant, rushing the puck over and over again, and kind of like keying the emotions of the team. But in a game where the Canadiens were playing against a team that's not amazing at even strength on the second half of a back-to-back, and they played a pretty strong game overall and like showed some fight, I didn't notice much fight out of Josh Anderson.
I noticed him for the first time. I think it was in the third, and there was a rush, and I saw him. I was like, okay, and it didn't end up being. I think it ended up being a pretty good shot on goal, and then he disappeared again. And I don't know. I feel like a player who is a power forward, right? Who wants that title, right? Who skates as upright as a power forward does, like he does, right? He's just, a player like that needs to be noticeable, right? He has to be. He has to be, not just from the fans, but I mean the other team has to notice him. They have to be aware. They should have to be aware of when he's on the ice, because he's going to roll over someone, right? He's going to bust the puck in and do something like direct and impressive. But not obviously not tonight.
Yeah, and I think this is like where the disconnect is on where the Canadiens valued Josh Anderson versus what he is as a player, where they saw his best version of himself and gave him that contract. And unfortunately, he's only that like 1 out of every 3 games. And yeah, there's a lot of big contracts on the Montreal Canadiens that need to be moved out or figured out. I don't know if Anderson can be moved with that contract. There was somebody who had a question earlier in the stream saying, like, if it's the same contract, same term, you want Lehkonen or Byron? Well, Byron is older.
Yeah.
And I don't think, like, Byron is a great penalty killer, don't get me wrong. But at even strength, I don't think he has anywhere close to the play driving or defensive ability of Arturi Lehkonen. And I really like Byron for his unique quality of him being able to score goals that there's only like 10 guys in the entire league that can score. So like the goals that he gets aren't necessarily goals where like you put somebody else in that spot and they score the same 15 goals. He scores goals that just disappear if you take him out of the lineup, so he has value there. But I think Lehkonen is just a way better overall player, so it would be Lehkonen for me.
Same. I love whenever Byron scores on a shorthanded breakaway. I think back to the video montage. He came from Calgary, right?
Yes.
Video montage of him missing breakaway after breakaway after breakaway. He has such impressive, and back then even better, escape velocity, right? It was just a matter of time before he started doing that. And he did in Montreal, and he's been that kind of a player, right? He kills penalties, gets those unexpected goals, makes the other team have to, respect that speed, sit back on their heels a bit. But the first thing to go as you age is your speed, right? Players talk about this all the time. You're smarter than ever. You know more about the game. You're more comfortable, but your feet go first. And so to bank on him in the future, sort of outlasting or maintaining that unique skill, well into his 30s, is you're expecting an awful lot more than history has told us, right? Whereas
100%.
Lehkonen's solid positional game doesn't rely on fleet feet, even though he's a fine skater. He's only gonna basically he's gonna be a long plateau kind of guy, right? Because his skill set is just I think age of anything will help him, right? The more experience he has, the more sort of little tiny elements he adds or learns and includes in his game. He's just going to get a little bit stronger. So that's a no-brainer for me.
Yeah, and I think the other thing is like Byron's coming back supposedly next game off of hip surgery that's caused him to miss over half of a season now.
Yeah.
So we don't actually know what Byron is going to look like. I hope he looks exactly like what we remember him as, because I really like, on a personal level, I really like Paul Byron. I think he's a good leader. I think he's a good role model for people in that room. He's really embraced the community here, but we don't know, right? There's a lot of question marks surrounding Paul Byron. We had a couple other questions here from the Discord. Basically a game of keep, trade, or buy out. Between, I guess we can just do the same question for all three. He's got three different questions here. I'm guessing it's not necessarily what would you do so much as what do you think is going to happen. The details are not there. It's just keep, trade, buyout of. So we'll start with Jeff Petry.
When is this contract up?
I mean, he just signed an extension, so it's a while. He just signed an extension until 2024, 2025, so 3 more years.
Okay, so you're not going to trade him. And you're not going to buy him. You're going to keep. You got to keep Petry.
Yeah.
I mean, this season has been an aberration, and I think we can. I think we can put to bed the idea that Petry is who he has been through much of the. He's not a tank commander, right? That's just not who he has been. There's no reason his game has to have that decline. I think he's going to prove to be a lot more valuable than the money you're going to get back from a buyout or the value you're going to get in a trade for him right now. So unless some team knocks your socks off, no, I'm keeping him.
Yeah, I think at 34 years old with 3 years remaining, it's even. I think the 6.25 outside of this season is very reasonable for Jeff Petry. Like you could maybe move that if he was 31 instead of 34, but
Right.
It becomes a perilous contract to take on for most teams. I think that he's a guy that, unless he expressly asks to be traded, is probably going to stay here at least until 2023. Yeah, that's not one that you're going to move. And I think Petry also, it probably depends on what happens with Carey Price. Like I have a tiny bit of inside information on like when Petry was traded to Montreal, why he decided to stay in Montreal when he was going to be an unrestricted free agent, was essentially that he became very good friends with Carey Price and liked to play on the same team as PK Subban. Now, shortly after, Subban was traded, but obviously, I mean, Petry loved Shea Weber. I don't think there's anybody that I've heard of that didn't love Shea Weber, the person, and also the player on that team. So easily replaced, but now Weber's gone, and now Carey Price's future is in flux.
Yeah.
So if Petry doesn't want to be here, say Carey Price is moved at some point, then it becomes a complicated question, right? But just based on the facts, it seems unlikely that Jeff Petry would be moving on. Christian Dvorak, I think for this one, it's eventually trade, but it's not right now.
Did he seem like a stopgap to you when they signed him
Yes.
at the start of the season?
Yeah.
I get that feeling, and they were basically trying to plug a hole. The problem is they plugged the hole, then the cannon fire went right through the hull 10 times, right? And so the ship is sinking, but they plugged that hole. The expectations on him when he came in, I'm sure the expectations that he had are totally misaligned at this point. The Canadiens thought they were getting someone who was going to serve a valuable role as they tried to, return to the playoffs at least. And he thought, yeah, they're a Stanley Cup finalist. I'm going to, really, maybe not a contender, but we're going to see what we can do. No one's happy, right? Neither side is happy with how this has turned out. And even though, he hasn't been an outrageous disappointment or anything like that. I can't imagine either side wanting to keep him around or stay around.
Yeah, I think Dvorak this year is such an outlier defensively from what he's had the rest of his career. It's like he's not a good defensive player, but this year he is like quite literally a bottom 5 player in the entire league in terms of defensive impact at even strength. That said, he still has excellent impacts defensively shorthanded, which is like, I know it's a different game, but to be that wildly off is pretty crazy. But I think he's a guy that like next year probably has a huge recovery in his underlying numbers as the team is not like crushing itself under the weight of what this season has become. And then maybe you can look at, his contract is so reasonable for a guy who is probably like a second, third line center on a decent team, like one of those tweener guys, right? I think they could move him relatively easily once he rebounds a little bit. It's just that teams will want to see that. But yeah, I don't think he's a long-term Montreal Canadien, unfortunately. I think that was just Marc Bergevin, not necessarily panicking per se, but reacting to the fact that he was going to lose Danault and Kokoniemi in one summer and had no plan to actually weather that loss. And he thought that they were still a playoff team, which was clearly very untrue. All right, and the last one is Yoel Armia. I think everyone who has watched this team this year is probably going to lean towards buyout. The contract is completely insane, and it was insane the day that they signed it. It was one of those, like, you're still high off of the pheromones of the playoffs, It's like when the Canadiens won that game on Jean-Baptiste Day, which, by the way, was Lehkonen who scored the winner. Right. It was like on that day, Marc Bergevin was like, we're signing Armia for 4 years. And it was a terrible decision. I don't know if they're going to end up buying him out because I feel like Armia is another guy who is having an outlier season.
Yeah.
I'm just not convinced that at his contract, anybody values him enough to take that on. So to me, that looks like either it is going to end up in a buyout or maybe a trade where they retain half of his salary. Or, I mean, this is the least definitive answer you could possibly ask for. Or they just keep him and he stays around during the rebuild. But I think the issue with that is that his effort level this year, and I know part of it is the way he plays looks effortless. Right. And that has a lot of people...
Not in a good way, though.
Yes, not in a good way.
Yeah,
because he's not scoring. Like, exactly, when he is scoring, looks great. But when he's not, and he's more often not than is... a terrible sentence. It just looks bad and it gets people on him, and I don't know if that's good for a rebuilding team.
Here's a question that people fail to ask a lot. Are you the kind of is this the kind of player who can play on a terrible team? Is this the kind of player? So, we have a lot of relative stats, right? But I bet you, if you look through, you go league wide, look through relative stats, some players on awful teams, do okay, right? They may outperform the terrible team baseline. Other players would go on a good team and play to that level. They'd go on a bad team and they'd play to that level or below. They just get worse as the team gets worse, and so they're not helping you, right? They're literally being dragged down by you. Actually, Petry in Edmonton. Now, they misvalued him completely, but he was a far less inspiring player in Edmonton, right? When they would do nothing but lose. This year in Montreal, they're doing nothing but lose. He's uninspiring again. I don't know, right? But I think that's an important psychological factor that you can't ignore. And it's obscured by the situation with COVID and lack of fans and the weird injuries and not having anyone to line up. There's so many complicating factors. But I think that's a question that you have to ask about every player that you want to keep around. Are they the type that's going to be dragged down? Or are they the type that are going to kind of like cling on with white knuckles and try to lift this team up from the depths that it's been in?
Yeah, I think that's like one of the biggest questions. It's like a combination of that and who are the guys that want to wear that jersey, and play for that jersey and play it with pride. And that's probably, outside of building his management team, the biggest question that Kent Hughes is going to have to face as he, looks at the rest of this season, because there's going to be a lot of guys who aren't traded at the trade deadline.
Yeah.
There's just not enough salary to go around in the NHL, and too many guys with term. I think the main guy that's going to be moved out is Ben Chiarot, because it's very obvious they're going to get good return for him. And other than that, I think a lot of the damage that they're going to have to do to break down the team is going to happen in the summer. And it may not even be all this summer. It might be next summer. There's a long time that this is going to have to happen over.
I mean, do you want to rebuild? Or do you want a reno, right?
Mm-hmm.
And if you want an actual rebuild, it's going to take. You were talking about this summer, next summer, the summer after, to some extent. Your comment about Chiarot. Do you think he's still going to get the value that people predicted he would get in a trade come the deadline? I mean, people were talking about a first. And coming off the playoffs last year, it was easy to say, oh yeah, if we need to get rid of him, we can do it for that. Are we still there, do you think?
See, to me, no. But from what I hear from people who know a lot more about NHL front offices, they think yes. I think there's a lot of people around the NHL who think that once the switch is flipped and playoff officiating arrives, Ben Chiarot becomes much more valuable, and they're willing to pay a lot for his nastiness, essentially. And, the fact that he has one of the worst goal differentials in the league over the last 3 years, including playoffs, does not deter teams for whatever reason. Over the last 3 years of defensemen who've played over 1,000 minutes, he is 14th worst in the league in terms of goal differential. Wow. And David Savard is 4th worst, by the way. So this team has a lot of guys that are not helping.
That's amazing.
Yeah,
I like those numbers are wow.
Yeah, I personally thought,
because people will hear and they won't offer anything. The trade offers will all start drying up. Like, oh, we heard the pod and we watched it. It was just, there's no way we can do this now.
If it was that easy to deter NHL GMs, I think there'd be a lot fewer bad decisions that go around. But I thought that Chiarot actually had a really strong season start to the season. The offensive play was great. And then the fact that he was with Jeff Petry kind of boosted his underlying numbers, even though Petry himself is having a poor season. Ever since Petry, I believe, went down first with an injury and then had COVID, Chiarot's numbers just really tanked. And I think that the longer this goes on, where they can see Chiarot away from Weber, away from Petry, then becomes the risk of oh, what are we paying for here? Which is why I'm if the Canadiens want to trade this guy, they should do it now. Also, there's the idea that he could get injured and then not be able to be traded at the deadline. So if I was Kent Hughes, I'd be doing this now.
Well, I mean, really, when you saw the season starting to slip away, I mean, he wasn't there obviously, but pick up that phone, right? Really, if you wait any longer, is there any possibility he's going to look better? I mean, teams might start bidding or something, or you might, closer to the deadline, people are more motivated. So maybe that makes some sense. But I don't know, putting out a feeler and seeing if someone wants to sort of jump the gun before this really valuable asset becomes a less valuable asset. I mean that, and you're right. When he's separated from the people who sort of help, he wasn't chopping lumber by himself in front of the net last year in the playoffs. And can he fulfill that function? A lot of these contending teams don't have a guy who is going to do that brutally hard-nosed stuff in front of the net. Last year, Montreal had 2 or 3 D who would do that, and that's kind of why it worked, right? If you just have one guy who does that, but he's a detriment in other areas, does that really help that much, right?
No.
Is that enough to Montreal can just played containment, right? They basically said, we need a strong defensive game. We need to knock people over, right? We need to close down the front of the net, and we have the bodies to do it, and they did. A lot of contending teams don't have that, right? And they don't want to play that way. So is he even going to be a match? Even though a lot of teams believe you need that kind of guy, is he going to fit into a more sort of high-powered offensive team with better puck moving? I don't know. If you're not going to shell up sometimes, I don't know if his value is that high.
Yeah, I'm not sure how he fits on a lot of teams, honestly. I know that Florida is after him. That's intriguing to me because they've kind of had a few guys go into Florida who haven't had the sorry, excuse me, haven't had the best career, let's say, and then really turned it around there. So that's a team that maybe you can slot Ben Chiarot into, and there's enough insulation where he can do what he likes to do and doesn't really hurt you. And they're so good offensively that his, really strong skating, for example, I mean, it's not agility wise strong skating, like he's not great at lateral movement, but in a
Once he gets
straight
going,
line, yeah, it's kind of like a lesser version of Dustin Bufflin, right? Where once he got going, he had decent
Steam
speed.
engine.
He just needed the whole racetrack to get there. And when you try to stop him, you die.
Right.
So Ben Chiarot, not quite at that level, but he can contribute a little bit offensively just because he's got a decent shot and isn't afraid to pinch. So that could be a fit. A lot of the other teams, like Edmonton, that was rumored to be in on him at one point, I don't see the fit there. I think that's a move that helps you sink,
Well,
but
I mean, Edmonton. Basically, I think teams, especially with with the revenue problems a lot of teams are facing, I think the teams have to believe they have a legitimate contending shot. You're not going to see this year like you have in previous years, I think, as much. Well, if you get in the playoffs, you have a chance. So let's try to do that. I think the general manager is going to be way more reluctant to do that. And I think they're going to be way more reluctant to move people in at the deadline unless they have a legitimate shot. And people, I mean, managers, teams delude themselves into thinking they have a legitimate shot or they're a contender. But is a team like Edmonton at this point going to say, yeah, this is our year? I mean, you got to try, right? You can't let these guys, your two all-stars wither on the vine. But at the same time, can you justify trading something important for the future for Ben Chiarot? And if you make the playoffs, I don't know. I can't see his value being that high, going to a team like that where there's going to be less competition for his services, I guess, is what I'm saying because of that.
Yeah, it's a funny situation for this year. And, I mean, Edmonton didn't even go in all in last year when McDavid and Draisaitl were putting up like the best offensive numbers like since Mario Lemieux.
Yeah.
And, they started this season the same way and it's kind of fizzled out a little bit, but it's a strange situation in Edmonton. But we'll wrap it up there. Thanks for joining me, Paul, and thanks everybody for watching. As I say every show now, if you're still watching this show in this season, I love you very much, and really thank you for the support because it means a lot. This is not how we wanted to start this show this season, but we're getting through it, and I feel like we're offering something fun for people who are not enjoying these games but watching anyway. So there's that. Before we go, Paul, tell everyone where they can find your stuff.
Sure. It's at InGoal Magazine primarily, so go there and look around. If on social media, I'm primarily on Twitter when I'm around, and my ad is at Way to Go Paul.
All-timer.
I know
tagline. I
considered changing to something like that's my name, or you're really professional, but no way. I mean, it's just too prime. I'm not giving that up.
Absolutely. And if anybody hasn't seen that short clip, just search Way to Go Paul. It is phenomenal. It's very junior hockey, or not even junior hockey. It's very minor hockey.
Yeah.
If anybody's had kids or family members in minor hockey and met a far too intense hockey parent. But yeah. All right. So thank you everybody for tuning in. Thanks, Paul, especially for joining me here tonight. Had great fun chatting with you all, and we'll see you on Saturday against the Oilers, who we just talked shit about. So I'm sure they'll pump 9 past the Canadiens.
10-1. Can't wait.
Perfect.